Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
July 14, 2020, the Roadmap Edition. First up, from the Houston Chronicle, business columnist Chris Tomlinson asks, is executive compensation obscene during a recession? Of course, you'll remember Gordon Gekko with greed is good, but as the coronavirus recession leaves millions of people unemployed, the American public's admiration for mega wealth is fading. As companies struggle to stay afloat, corporate boards need to rethink executive compensation. Of course, corporate officers in the United States are the most overpaid executives on the planet. No other nation showers management teams with so much money, and many nations limit how much a chief executive more can make than median employees. It's an interesting op-ed piece. The Houston Chronicle is not a left-wing raging newspaper, so when the Houston Chronicle business columnist says executive compensation is getting unseemly, there may be something to that, and execs need to rethink that. Next up, from Politico, the first time Politico joins us on the Daily Compliance News, a corruption crisis puts Bulgarian leader on the ropes. The president says the EU can no longer keep its eyes wide shut on Bulgaria's rule of law programs. For more than a decade, German Chancellor Merkel and other right-center EU leaders have never wanted to peer too deeply into how their Bulgarian ally runs his country, but they are now having to do so by lifting the lid on his premiership. They are laying bare the unaccountable oligarchs that have wrapped their tentacles around key government institutions such as the judiciary. Since Thursday night, the Balkan nation has erupted in the biggest wave of anti-government protests in 7 years, and it is largely around corruption. So once again, corruption leads the pack for political change, and it will be interesting to see what, if anything, the EU does about it. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Mingy Sun reporting, the Serious Fraud Office got some very good news as it finally got a conviction with 2 former Unaoil group managers convicted on charges relating to a scheme to pay bribes for securing contracts in Iraq. Zayed Akil and Stephen Whitley were convicted of conspiracy to make corrupt payments. And this is the first win for the SFO in quite some time. So finally get some good news for or from the SFO and the conviction of 2 Unaoil executives, although it's hard to believe that any Unaoil executive could ever be found not guilty of paying bribes given the corrupt level of that company. And finally, an interesting piece from the New York Times about how Google might fight an antitrust case. In a little notice paper sent by a search giant to Australian regulators, argues that the company doesn't control enough of the digital ad industry to overcharge customers or block competitors. Google has stayed quiet about its conversations with the U.S. government, but in a 67-page document sent to Australian regulators in May, it may show how Google tried to get out of the antitrust claims against it. Its argument is that even though it accounts for almost 30% of the spending in the global digital ad market, that is not enough control of the industry to overcharge customers and box out its competitors. It's certainly a novel argument, but one that might actually have some weight in the court of law. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Daily Compliance News, which is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. This month on the Compliance Live, I feature Scott Sullivan. Check it out.